Welcome to KBcast, the podcast for security executives, interviewing people from around the globe on how organizations can operate smarter and stay safer. Here's Carissa Breen.
I sat down with Ben Johnson, the founder of Carbon Black, but has since gone on to develop other businesses including Obsidian Security. Ben discusses his thoughts on frictionless security for SaaS and why this is super important. Ben discusses his thoughts on how to future-proof SaaS security and why this is becoming an area we need to pay attention to. If you're keen to learn more about Ben and his thoughts, then this episode is for you, so please keep on listening. So, Ben, I connected with you on Twitter and we're connected on LinkedIn, but I think you may have reached out to me a while ago. And then when we were doing our next season of podcasts, I remembered and I was like, I've got to hit up this Ben Johnson guy because I really like your story, your pedigree, what you've actually done. So before we talk about your experience and what you're doing today, I'd like to really start off with kind of your journey and talk to our audience a little bit about how you got into security and how you sort of managed to do all the things that you've been doing with all the other companies and then through to Obsidian. So I'm really keen to hear your story. So over to you.
How much time do you have?
Well, a lot.
No, I joke, but it's easy for us to all to ramble on, I think, when we're telling our story. I had an interesting start. So I was always very interested in computer science and just sort of computers and technology in general. Mm-hmm. But then I was watching this movie, Enemy of the State, in college. And if anyone's, maybe old enough to remember, sort of late 90s movie, but it was Will Smith and Gene Hackman, and it was kind of all about NSA, National Security Agency. And I was like, whoa, this is really cool. And so quite literally that week, or it might even been the next day, but we'll be saying it was that week. I applied to NSA and got in and, went through polygraphs and all that stuff and ended up having a pretty awesome journey in the intelligence community. And, there was stuff there that I would have done for free and they were paying us. And it was all around, cybersecurity. And it was really when some of that stuff like NSA in general wasn't really that well known. Now it's kind of, in the news all the time. And I don't even think it was called cybersecurity back then. It was called, information security or computer security or other things, early 2000s up till 2007, but it was fantastic and certainly a lot going on for the United States in terms of different, armed conflicts and things like that we were able to support. And it was also this almost like an entrepreneurial space itself, because you couldn't just Google for the answers when you're building, different capabilities and working in, kind of cutting edge intelligence. And so you really had to develop that mindset of, kind of building things from scratch or just sort of figuring things out. And then, after a while, I got a little bit tired of that life and that role and wanted to do something different and ended up with a friend. We started doing some just sort of general cybersecurity work and ended up getting called in to do a lot of incident response, digital forensics and that kind of thing. This is late 2000s. And my friend ended up coming up really with the idea for Carbon Black, continuous recording of endpoints of hosts, and really saying like, hey, if we're on the offensive, what would we hate to go against? Okay, something that like kind of recorded your every move, a surveillance camera. So anyways, like I said, I can talk forever about this, but anyways, saw that go from really nothing, like there's really about three of us at the beginning, two mics and myself. And lo and behold, a few years later, it was, hundreds and hundreds of people, up to 800 people. And I ended up flying around the world talking to security teams of all shapes and sizes about really all things security, but certainly endpoints. And then in 2017, I said, we're 800 people. I'm doing 100 flights a year globally. Let's do something new. And so I moved out to California and started Obsidian Security with my friends Glenn and Matt. And here we are. So I'm happy to talk more about my history, but it's really intelligence community sparked by a movie and intrigue there, and then a startup, Carbon Black. And then, I've been involved in other, startups and other things as well. But, here we are at Obsidian in 2020.
I have to say, I love the name, actually. I think I was speaking to one of your VP of Privacy and Trust, Laura, and I was like, wow, that's such an awesome name. And then obviously I knew that you were working there as well. So it was just, I don't know, I just really love the name. But talk to me a little bit more about 100 flights a year. How is that going just like on your like physical and mental health? That's a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. I was in, I'd be in 6 time zones in 7 days. I don't know how much context this is for various listeners, but one time I had lunch in Chicago, dinner in Seattle, and breakfast in Boston over an 18-hour period, and that just wears on you, But yeah, it was great in terms of the exposure, getting to talk to people in Asia, in the Middle East, in Europe, of course, all over North America, and in Australia, and just getting to see what's going well and what's not on teams of, again, sort of all shapes and sizes, from the best of the best to the teams that are just starting out. And, lo and behold, I think it really did put a, strain and stress on body and mind and everything. So I'm happy that I'm not doing that right now, for sure.
And so before we get into sort of the genesis of Obsidian, do you think that because you were doing 100 flights a year, it was very taxing on your body and on your mental health? Do you think that was sort of the catalyst to you going, okay, like I built this company, it's doing really, really well, but now I sort of want to turn a new leaf and start the Obsidian sort of gig? Or like what were you thinking, and where was your sort of head at when you came up with doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think part of it was we were at the size, like I said, around 800 people, and starting to even scale beyond that, where it was more about the scaling and less about building new stuff, right? And then you combine that with me being on the road all the time, again, even internationally, or being gone for multiple weeks at a time from my family. I think it all just sort of culminated in, I need something new, and so I think it was a combination of factors, but it certainly was tiring.
And so when you talk about scaling, you're doing more of the scaling versus the building. What do you think you prefer? I'm guessing the building?
I love building. Yeah. Scaling's fun, and certainly scaling at the sort of earlier scale stages of going from nothing to a few customers to a bunch of customers, bunch of employees. I think that's really fun. And I think every stage is fun, but I really like the early creation part, where it's all creativity and, hopefully innovation and really that entrepreneurial spirit. I love that.
Do you think that by the time you scale to a company of around 800 people, does it become sort of not like a corporate, but it kind of falls into that bucket, because that's still a relatively large organization, and it's obviously there's a lot of processes and policies that are wrapped around at the day-to-day operations of the business? Do you sort of think that, did you have that moment when you're like, I love this, but I don't know if it's really for me? Because like you said, you love building things and you like the early stage of a business, but then once it gets relatively large, which is what you've grown it into, do you sort of think that I'm done here? And is that sort of when you're keen to sort of start something else? And do you think that when Obsidian gets to that size, do you think you'll do the same?
Great question. I don't know. I think it's so many factors that, if Obsidian tomorrow hit 800 people, would I want out? I don't think so, but it is a long journey to get there. I do think also, I think around 500 people is when it really started to change. Not necessarily for the worse or anything like that, just different, where you're now starting to see large numbers of people that you don't know anymore, right? Because the first few hundred people, you kind of know everyone, and at least faces, if not names as well. And then once you get to like around 500, there's just so much going on and so many customers. And, and part of it also was it had been about 7 years, and I've always been, kind of I want to always work on all sorts of new stuff kind of person. So, part of it could have been the time, but it'll be interesting to see when Obsidian gets to be that big, what happens to me.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about Obsidian. Like, what are you guys actually doing? It's pretty interesting what you guys are doing for multiple reasons, which we'll get into in a little bit. But talk to me about sort of what you guys are doing and what your sort of vision is for the company. And I have to ask, like, where did you get the name from as well?
So I could tell you that we were huge Game of Thrones fans, and Obsidian plays a prominent role there, but that's not actually the truth. We certainly played it up, and we all watched Game of Thrones together and stuff. And if you haven't watched it, anyone in the audience, it's a prominent part of the story. A buddy of mine, a guy named Eddie, we were sitting in Chicago before I moved to California, and he said, if I ever started a tech company, I would use the name Obsidian, and I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. I'm like, can I use that? He's like, yeah, because he works in professional sports and, just a great guy. And then when we came here, it wasn't necessarily going to be our name, but it was one of the options. And so we threw around a whole bunch of different options and tried a bunch of things. And inevitably that's the thing that stuck. And also it's black, it's a black rock and carbon black. So it sort of worked in that sense too. So, kind of an interesting story. And then, we just wanted to come together and build something new and not focus on endpoint security, because that's what me and Matt and Glenn had all done was endpoint security. So we wanted to focus on cloud for this time around.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so let's sort of talk about, as you're well aware of, like companies are sort of moving towards SaaS type models, because in terms of how they operate now is fundamentally changed, right? So do you believe that because of this, it's sort of causing a strain from a security perspective? Like, what are your sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, we live in this world every day around SaaS security. And, what we did is we went out and talked to hundreds of organizations, basically went back to a lot of our great customers from either Carbon Black or Cylance, which is where Glenn and Matt came from. And they gave us lots of good feedback. And a lot of the feedback was, hey, I don't have any idea what's going on in these SaaS applications. And that was in early 2017. And now, fast forward 3 years, we have CISOs seeking us out and saying, hey, the journey is going to end in SaaS, right? Like everything's going that way. I have no idea what's going on from a security perspective, where either the SaaS technology, the SaaS application came in through IT and security is trying to handle it, or it might have even come in through these different business units and maybe even IT wasn't involved. And now security is responsible for, monitoring Zoom or monitoring Workday or monitoring GitHub or all these different applications. And so, yeah, I think it's affording a lot of efficiencies and innovation, but certainly security. None of us grew up defending SaaS. We grew up defending networks or endpoints, right? So it is this new world, and I think everyone's trying to figure out the right way to do it.
So why do you believe that this will be the future? Sort of, as you touched on before, that CISOs are saying that this is going to be the future and this is going to be this will be what happens. Why do you think that's the case? Why do you think we'll end up there?
Yeah, I think we want to more and more focus on our core mission as a business. Like pick any random business. If they could get rid of all the stuff that isn't truly adding value to their customers or isn't their competitive, differentiation, they would get rid of it. And I think that's why you're seeing cloud. That's why you're seeing SaaS specifically, because you no longer need to manage all this hardware or these data centers. And, some of that stuff will still be around, but, most organizations are really adopting a cloud forward or cloud first mentality. And so if they can put all their email, their source code, whatever, they're going to do that in the SaaS apps, as well as you see places like Amazon or Microsoft try to get to serverless compute. Well, that's basically just telling a SaaS app to perform certain functions for you. And then finally, like you look at startups like us, everyone gets a MacBook Pro and the rest of our business is SaaS or some AWS, right? That's it. Yeah. Like there's nothing to deploy, nothing to manage, no big IT team. So I do think it's the future, or at least a big portion of the future.
I had a chat with a guy actually over in the US from AWS, and we're sort of talking about the mentality around sort of on-prem and then sort of hybrid and then full adoption to cloud. And sort of one of the key drivers that he spoke about is just really about the mentality of people sort of letting go of what they used to do and what was traditionally done. Do you think the same sort of applies now? I would say that I'm very much on the same belief when you talk about cloud and SaaS and all that, and maybe because I'm a millennial, but I think it's just also because I see value in it, and I like the approach of being anywhere in the world, and you don't have all the problems that I guess traditionally would be there if you're doing sort of on-prem stuff. So what do you sort of think in terms of, do you think that it's still people's mindsets that are holding them back? Like, well, we haven't done it like this. We haven't seen an engagement model like this. What do you sort of think when it comes to people's approach and adoption towards this?
Yeah, I think part of it is what you're comfortable with. So like I said, if you're grew up monitoring networks or having the server room in the back and kind of knowing where your data is, it's kind of hard to just sort of magically put that in the, quote unquote cloud and hope that it's all secured properly and that your team knows how to configure and, monitor properly. So I think part of it's that, sometimes it is contracts or other aspects of the business that make you retain stuff either in a, private data center or on premise. So I think part of it might be more business driven, but I do think, so many businesses we talk to, which is kind of, again, all shapes and sizes, are going cloud forward or cloud first. That, I think it's just forcing people to change. The other thing I saw was Microsoft said in the first 2 months, at least in the US really of COVID, they saw 2 years worth of cloud migration efforts. And so it's just,
wow.
It was already going fast, but now it's, to your point, we need to work from anywhere. We need to work from home. Do we even have offices? And I don't want to, steer the conversation completely there, but the point is like cloud affords you to kind of continue working regardless of these, influences. And so I think it's only going to continue.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When I was sort of doing a little bit of research on yourself and Obsidian, there was a comment that I read, and it sort of talked about Obsidian cloud detection and response delivers frictionless security for SaaS. So that was something that I've read on one of your white papers. Can you talk to me a little bit more about what you mean by this statement specifically?
Yeah. So one of the things we wanted to do when we set out to build this was really kind of use the power of SaaS to defend SaaS. And what we mean is it needs to be easy. It needs to be fast time to value. When you set up a SaaS, email or SaaS file sharing app like Box or Dropbox or any of these, you basically fill out a little bit of information and click a couple buttons and you're up and running, right? And so we really wanted the same thing for Obsidian, which is really when you onboard some of these different applications for us to monitor and help you secure, you're really just, again, kind of clicking a few buttons and giving us some API keys or tokens or things like that with really nothing to deploy. And so really what we're talking about is there's very little burden on the, IT or security team to deploy us. And then there's nothing that the employees have to do. So none of your, you could have 100,000 employees. None of them have to change how they work. And all of a sudden you have a new capability on the security team. So that was really a big part of what we were trying to do. And especially coming from our endpoint security days. And I love endpoint security, but we had to go in and ask companies to install an agent on every single laptop, right? And so we really wanted this to be very, very low friction, basically frictionless, where a couple clicks and you have this new security capability. So that's really what we mean by frictionless. And then detection and response is really it's focused on continuous monitoring, looking for threats, looking for compromise, that kind of thing, and then helping you do incident response and remediation to kind of clean it up. So it's a long statement, but that's really how we break it down.
When you said before the power of SaaS to defend SaaS, so do you think because of this and because of what you guys are trying to do in terms of the defending side of it, do you think that this will become easier then over time? And do you think as a result of that, like a byproduct will be that the industry will become better off?
I hope so. Yeah. I think when I think to your question a few minutes ago, a little while ago, when a security team or a business unit or whatever is looking at adopting a new SaaS platform, one of the questions they often ask is like, well, how am I going to monitor this? How am I going to, investigate if we have an issue, a leak, that kind of thing. And so if there's more capabilities out there that make a security team feel like they have the visibility, feel like they have some monitoring, I do hope that it will help drive just more SaaS adoption as a whole. And, like I said earlier, like CISOs are starting to say like the journey is going to end in SaaS. So, everyone wants to get there, wants to have less and less to worry about and just worry about the business value or the application value. And so if we can help play a part, I think that'll be great.
So when we talk about the journey and ending in SaaS, where do you sort of think that the large enterprises and multinationals, like how far off do you think they are? And you spoke before that within the first month of COVID, Microsoft's seen an adoption in terms of 2 years in terms of increase. Do you think that these enterprises will take their time to sort of get there, or do you think they're moving in the right direction and it's not something that you can just sort of happen overnight? It is a bit of a process, but what are your sort of thoughts on that?
I think to your point, it is a bit of a process. We already are talking to everyone, to the top Fortune companies that are massive, and they all have SaaS, right? Everyone has SaaS, like sort of Office 365 or G Suite, or maybe it was Salesforce or whatever. They sort of broke the broke the mold, and then it was kind of this dam, and all the water rushed through, and it's all like, SaaS is everywhere. And, some of these companies have 800 different SaaS apps that they use. And so, I do think there's still a bunch of migration or sort of transformation to go on. But I think pretty much every company out there is already looking at this. And we even talk to, government agencies and stuff like that. And they're already doing a lot of this either through the government clouds or they want to figure out how they can use some of these tools to make their teams, maybe more productive. So I think it's all here, regardless of if you're, 1 million employees or 10, it's here. And it's just a matter of how much of your business is running off of it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, well, I totally agree with your points there. So what I'd love to do now is probably just let's dive into some case studies specifically on what you guys are doing at Obsidian, because I think it's really, really important for people to understand specifically on how you guys are actually tackling all of these challenges and problems that they're probably sitting there listening going, yeah, I have that problem. So you guys spoke about unused privileges to increase the attack surface. So can you walk our listeners through how you guys are solving this problem?
Yeah. So, one of the things we said is, look, you have to connect into these different applications, and, we do all that work, but you have to connect into all these applications, pull the data around who the users are, like who are the accounts, who are the identities, and then also the behavior, like what's going on from an activity perspective. And then once you can really pull all that and maybe do it across applications, right? So you're pulling Office 365 data and Salesforce and Zoom and Box and, pick a bunch of applications. You're pulling all that back, and then you can start to do some analysis, and you can say, okay, first and foremost, where are all the accounts that have no activity, right? Because if they have no activity, you might as well just shut them off. That's a huge problem. We see like 30% of your accounts are typically idle, inactive, and they're turned on. And then we see a bunch of times those get compromised because, no one's really watching out for them or maintaining them anymore, but they're still turned on, maybe even you're getting charged by the SaaS provider for the licenses for those. But anyways, that's sort of step one, is trying to right size your access. And then from there, it's looking at privilege and looking at who are all the administrators or different privileged users. And then are those users, first of all, should they be doing that based on their title or their role or that kind of thing in the business? And we see a lot of users that typically were added maybe a couple years ago or whatever, and they're like, well, wait, why does this person have admin privileges in Office 365? But then also, if you can see what the people are actually doing in the application and say, oh, this guy never actually does anything that requires administrator level rights, why not just get rid of him, right? He's still doing his job. You can see with data that you're not going to harm his productivity. And so trying to do some of those sort of outcomes is part of what we're trying to do, which is, reduce access, reduce privilege without hurting productivity, because that's a key part of SaaS, right, is productivity. And there's plenty of other things we do, but I think that is a big part of what we're trying to do, which is just help you see what's going on in these applications so then you can reduce the surface area.
So do you believe that there are a lot of companies out there who are not really aware about all of their employees' privileges? As you spoke before, that there could be someone that has admin rights for O365 but aren't even utilizing it. So do you think that, I worked in organizations before where I think this is a massive problem in terms of auditing it, monitoring it, ensuring who has more privileged access than others. Do you still feel like this is a large problem in terms of people not even knowing where they sit when it comes to this type of stuff? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, especially in SaaS, because SaaS, typically you might be able to control access through single sign-on, a tool like Okta or other ways where you try to get all your employees logging in through a central place. But the actual privilege levels and whether they're admin or not might, often still lives in the SaaS applications themselves. And so you have to kind of go app to app looking. And a lot of times the security team doesn't even have access to some of these applications. They have to go ask IT or the business unit. And then, we see everyone we install in, we see quite often, I guess you could call it identity creep or privilege creep, where there's just a lot of people that have administrator level rights and, different levels of sophistication, but often it's quite high. And that's one of the recommendations we typically give is, hey, here's a bunch of users you might want to reduce their privileges.
Mm-hmm. And when you spoke before about that there was a whole bunch of people that weren't even, there was no activity, it was just idle. Why do you think that these sort of privileges were turned on in the first place? Was it just default and then it sort of just stayed that way and then no one knew and then no one audited and then finally you guys came in and you saw it and then you shut it down? What do you think sort of the reasoning behind that is?
Yeah, I think it's you when someone comes to you with a request, typically you want to help them, right? You want to allow them to do their job, but then they might only need that access for a day or a week or a month, or even if it's years, but then all of a sudden they don't need it. They don't necessarily call somebody up and say, I don't need this anymore, or they leave the business and sometimes the accounts just don't get turned off. And so, especially with someone like a contractor where the internal employee who brought in the contractor or sort of sponsored them, maybe that internal employee left. So no one knows who this contractor is. So everyone's afraid to shut it off because you don't know if it's going to break some critical system, right? So, I mean, I could go on. And I used to give a talk called Identity Creep, and it would, I'd have a line out the door if people ask me questions after because it hit home so well. But this, sort of the way you can like monitor and then try to tie that back to are people still using their accounts? I think it's needed because it's such a problem that we've just sort of left all these accounts turned on even though they're no longer in use.
I've been in the position before where there was all these really expensive like contractors in, and then they actually just got rolled off completely. And then like trying to reinstate them was an absolute nightmare and a mission. I had just started in this company, they're like, oh, we have to like reinstate like 50 of these people because they're really, really expensive and they're costing us a lot of money per day that they can't access anything. So I actually had sort of the other side of it, and then it becomes a problem because their access wouldn't just come back straight away. And it became a massive bottlenecking because you had to constantly just manually audit it. And of course, you would know that there's so many problems with that. And when you've got hundreds of thousands of people that you're just manually auditing and monitoring, it becomes really overwhelming. And then you have problems like this all of the time because you may think, I think I was using a spreadsheet back then to say, okay, this guy's access because his contractor goes to this date. So before this date, I have to make sure extend it out. I've been in that position before, and there's a lot of bottlenecking that does happen when people's access just gets sort of cut off quite with being blindsided by it as well.
Yeah, you're hitting the nail on the head. Like a lot of times the reason this access sort of creep or this excess access exists in the first place is because everyone's afraid to give up access, right? In those organizations you're at, if it was an easier onboarding or granting, problem process, the provisioning process was easier, then everyone's like, sure, I know I can get this back easily if I need it again. So sure, I'll give it up. But quite often it's a very painful process to get access. So once you have it, you're going to hold on to it even if you don't need it, right?
Oh, 100%. And I remember just from memory, it was like, on Mondays, like no one's getting access because obviously everyone in the company was trying to like request access. So the whole thing was really slow. And yes, everyone just sort of knew like if someone's access was being cut off by Monday, like you're just not still going to have access until like Tuesday. So I've lived and breathed that problem. And I agree. People want to hold on to stuff because provisioning those rights is a mission. And then when you obviously take those sort of privileges away from people, it can get a little bit political. So I've been definitely on that receiving end of all of those conversations. So what I'd love to talk to you about next is when you guys talk about future-proofing SaaS security, and we may sort of touch on it a little bit before, but I'd love you to go in a little bit of more detail about how Obsidian's sort of approaching this. Yeah.
So I think there's a couple ways. First from us as a vendor or on the product side, what we're saying to teams is like we're going to do the work of handling any changes to your SaaS applications APIs, right? So if Office 365 comes out with new capabilities that allow for even better monitoring, like we're going to just handle that, right? So, if you deploy something like us, like we're going to do the work of trying to keep up, as well as we're going to keep adding more and more coverage, more and more, integrations and things like that. So naturally and this should be true with any vendor. Like if you invest in a vendor on January 1, when you go to renew next Jan 1, they should be giving you a better product, right? If your vendor's not doing that, like go somewhere else. And so trying to just, keep up with changes as well as anticipating just, kind of what data we're going to need and things like that. And then internally, as we try to secure Obsidian, so us as like a, just a business, we tend to look at, what are our vendors doing in terms of making, logging and data available? What are they doing with their thoughts on privacy? What are they doing on, sort of different ways we can control access? And, how responsive are they when things start to change, so we can, really make sure that we can get a handle on any changes as they occur. So, I think really it comes down to, where's your business going, and can you work with different vendors that are going to help you, sort of meet you there, or help take care of most of the work of the change for you, I think is fundamentally it. And that's what we try to do is, integrate with more and more SaaS apps, as well as handle any changes as the apps themselves get updated or have API changes.
So when you go to a client, and I mean, a lot of the time people are very, very overwhelmed in this space, as you're well aware of, and you're sort of saying, like, we can deploy all this monitoring and we can manage this for you. Do you see like a massive relief in people's faces? They're like, oh my gosh, thank God, like, because I feel overwhelmed as it is, and now I have a never-ending to-do list, and then on top of that, I don't even know how to be monitoring these people through SaaS, and then sort of you guys come in and be able to alleviate a lot of that pressure. So how are those sort of conversations going with some of the clients that you've got in terms of them being very reliant on what you guys are doing?
Yeah, I think, first and foremost, it's sort of what we talked about before, which is most of us grew up in network security or host-based security. And so, what are threats looking like in the SaaS space, or what are risks looking like, and what's going on, and what should you be on the lookout for, and things like that. So I think, first of all, it starts with bringing knowledge to the table. And so, the customer doesn't necessarily have to be an expert. And then when you think about SaaS, you're going to have a whole bunch of SaaS apps. So then you multiply that. You don't have to be an expert in these, 15 different apps or whatever you're trying to secure. And then, doing the work of pulling the data, centralizing it, and then trying to like condense it down into like simple like alerts or other things. And, so yeah, I think there's a lot of relief because it is this new area. It's getting more and more business attention, right? It's very much critical in a lot of situations now around, your sensitive files, your email, whatever. And then security teams, just weren't really built to like understand this part of the tech stack. And don't get me wrong, security teams are great. And, part of, I think, InfoSec that draws people into InfoSec is that they're the kind of people that want to continuously learn and, kind of keep up with the latest trends and try to defend them or whatever. But it's still a huge burden. And we all know cybersecurity teams are often just, inundated with work. So if we can help them alleviate some of that or save them some time, they're quite often thankful for that.
That was a really interesting point that you touched on before about bringing knowledge together, and you spoke about security teams not necessarily knowing all of the latest trends. So how do you think, as an industry now, there's a lot of different vendors out there. There's a lot of different players out there, globally speaking. Do you think that customers feel incredibly overwhelmed? And do you also believe that people are going and doing their own vendor analysis? And how do you think they're sort of getting this information so they understand what vendors that are A, out there, and B, like what type of problems they solve? Because there are so many people in this space now than there ever was before. I'm just really keen to hear your thoughts because you are on that vendor side.
Yeah, I think security teams and CISOs and such are quite sick of, all the inundation of vendor emails and such. And so I think they're looking to, podcasts, for an example, or, different ways where they can try to find intelligent conversation is sort of one bucket. I think another bucket is the trusted partner, right? So whether it's a consultant, a value-added reseller, a managed security provider, everyone I talk to that's in those kinds of businesses is just unbelievably busy in a good way, right? I mean, there's just so much demand from clients to help them figure out what they should be deploying, how best to optimize their security stack, how best to hire people, or can they get some surge capacity or these other things. So yeah, I think security teams and security leadership in general are trying to figure out what actually is going to add value and sort of move the needle. And the other thing I would say is I think they're also trying to figure out how they can squeeze more out of their investments, right? So if you invest in various vendors, can you get more out of the tools that, like what are you using your endpoint security tool for? Or what are you using this tool for, right? And so, I would say, like, if you use our tool, like, can you get as much out of it as possible? So yeah, I think there's a lot going on, and all in all, like, security teams get a bit tired of the explosion of security vendors, and now they're trying to figure out how to navigate that without, spending their whole life just in vendor pitches.
Absolutely. And one of the things you said, like they're trying to get as much out of their vendor as possible. I think I had a conversation a while back now, and the guy was sort of saying, like, it was a vendor guy, and he was just sort of talking about, like, there's a lot of vendors out there that go into a company, but they don't actually continuously train the internal staff of, like you said before, if they're bringing out new features or they've done a whole lot of development work and there's probably a whole bunch of new stuff that the client didn't already know about. How do you sort of approach that from a vendor perspective to ensure that your clients are getting the absolute best that they can out of what you guys are doing? Like, how do you keep that conversation going and getting these people interested? Because ultimately, I see that a lot, especially working myself on a client side, that people would just come in, deploy whatever it was, and then we'd never see them again. And there's a lot of that happens. And I think there's a lot of people who don't do that. And I know that that you spoke about this before publicly. So I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on how you sort of approach that problem.
Yeah. So I think it's hard enough, but what makes it even harder is often you go through the vendor process, they like your product, you get installed, and then the person who did all that work moves on to another job or another company or whatever. And now it's a new person who wasn't involved in any of the trial or any of the original training. And, so it is a tough problem. I think it's a combination of a few things. I think first and foremost, you need to be very responsive to any sort of customer questions or requests. Secondly, you need to try to reach out and, have that human touch and, hey, what can I tell you about? Or have you seen this kind of thing? And then third, it's more of the kind of continuous updates of like, this is what's new, or here's some cool like big feature that we just released. Maybe we're going to send you a video of how it works, as well as in the product itself, having the little, sort of guided tours and walkthroughs and stuff like that, trying to just make sure you're sort of educating as much as possible without overburdening yourselves by, spending all your time on that. And then finally, if you can get there, getting to a community state. And I thought we did this really well at Carbon Black, which is we would have some of the coolest companies out there with really phenomenal security teams in this online forum sharing rules and API scripts and best practices and all this other things. So then it really starts to scale because everyone's just helping each other. So you still need the vendor to be, sort of the subject matter expert of the product or the space, but you had just had so many other experts that didn't even work for Carbon Black and, ideally for Obsidian, we'll get there soon, where you have this online community where everyone's just trading information and helping each other out.
No, I think that's a really, really good idea because it's just been a theme as of lately of people talking to me on and off the podcast just about information overload and where people are sort of going to get this information on the industry in general, but then specifically talking on, well, we've got all of these different vendors, like how are we actually managing that relationship with our vendors to ensure that we're getting the information we need? Because like you said, the guy that you probably sold the stuff to, he may have moved on and then a new person comes in there and then you feel like, oh, I have to prove myself again because we've already gone through this and the whole sales cycle is like 12, 18 months, 2 years. And now a new guy's come in and he's probably not necessarily as keen on us as the previous guy was. And then I think it's kind of like this vicious cycle that happens and people need to ensure that they're constantly communicating with their clients. And like you mentioned before, that's one thing I really like about you is because you were saying like if there's a new feature that's come out, you guys are going to be talking about that and whatever means possible. And I really like the online forum that you've spoken about as well, as I think that you guys are sort of bringing together a community of people to talk about their problems and you guys are sort of just being the subject matter expert that you touched on. So I really love that. So then what I'd like to sort of ask you lastly is just really talking about your thoughts on the future of security in the SaaS space and how do you see it changing in terms of interconnection and expectation? Starting with the small questions, aren't you?
Yeah. Well, SaaS is not going away, as I think we've all said, and you see, just massive companies like Salesforce or, of course, Microsoft and such, who are just continually producing software in the SaaS, sort of mode. And so it's not going away. And I think it's becoming ever increasingly useful to us as, sort of businesses to adopt SaaS because it does afford us then focus. Like we can focus more and more on what we want to be doing versus managing and configuring and all these other things. And so I think SaaS is not going away. I think you're starting to get more awareness from security teams and businesses that they have to think about security when it comes to SaaS, because for a long time they thought, oh, it's in the cloud. They're going to do it all for me. And it's like, no, you still have to defend and make sure the right people have access and things like that. And then from there, I think it's trying to figure out like, okay, does every SaaS app have multi-factor authentication capabilities, which I'm surprised actually a lot still don't. I was kind of shocked, like they don't. But do they have MFA and other ways to sort of protect, sort of login and access? Can they be integrated into single sign-on and stuff like that, so you can get a better handle around, sort of a choke point of everyone's logging in through a central place? Do you have monitoring, that kind of thing? Can we standardize the logging and the monitoring? Because quite frankly, everyone does it their own way. So I think that's an area that security could improve on. And then, like the other thing that's really key here is clouds talk to clouds, or SaaS talks to SaaS, right? Like how many of us have gone in and said, oh yeah, I'm going to authorize my Google Drive to give access to, this other SaaS app so it can read my Google Drive files, and, maybe it helps you for whatever reason. But now there's that like programmatic or, system connection that really has no human, but now that's another opening into your company's, SaaS app. So I think there's just going to be a lot of focus on how do we make sure this problem doesn't overwhelm us of just everything's connected, everything's always on, everything's available. And maybe how can we use our behavior and our activity to help inform decision making, right? So if you see that no one in your company is connecting from a whole continent, just block the continent from having access to Office 365. You can actually do stuff like that, but we don't, because everyone's afraid, because they're not quite sure how the products are being used. So I think, how does the future, like way down the road, look like? I don't know. Hopefully each SaaS app has better built-in capabilities, and then you can help centralize them or pull them together in your security team. But I think in the meantime, you just have to take an eye on how can I do something now, and whether it's reduction of access or better logging and monitoring or more sort of threat detection or whatever it is. I think you got to do something.
That's a really great point that you mentioned about the two-factor authentication. I myself have noticed that. So why do you think this is not incumbent of any sort of company when they're building an application to ensure that that's a feature? Because I have noticed that myself, and it does send question marks, and I'm just really keen to hear your thoughts. I feel like that's a very obvious thing that I would personally do, but maybe it's more obvious to security people than it is to companies that are perhaps just purely from a development background.
Yeah, I think I even heard you talking about this on a podcast or something too. But like a couple times we didn't even think to ask in the initial conversation about security, because you just I just take it as such a necessity, such a given. But if you're really like a software engineering team and you're trying to solve a business problem and you're really not coming from any aspect of the security world, I guess it's just not something that you think is mandatory yet. And so, it does come back to then just simple username and password. So I think it's on all of us to do a better job, quite frankly, of education and awareness. You can almost not fault someone just because they don't know that this is such a bad problem if they've never been in the industry. And I'm not going to let them off the hook completely, but yeah, I don't know. I'm still kind of flabbergasted some of the vendors we've had to work with that don't have MFA, because it just 2FA MFA seems so vital today.
Do you think now? I mean, this is a pretty out there question. The right guy to answer it. We speak about, as you just mentioned before, about multi-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication is not at all even part of a lot of these vendors or these companies that are out there. Do you think that perhaps in the future there could be like a global standard that's rolled out that, like, if you have a SaaS-based product, you must have multi-factor or two-factor or something to that level, or else, I don't know, you get fined or you lose your license or something like that. Do you think that could ever be a thing?
Yeah, I do. Now, whether it's more you won't get business because you don't have 2FA, or it's an actual like regulatory demand or obligation, I'm not sure how far, and especially with SaaS is kind of global, so whose jurisdiction and all that stuff. But I do think, I mean, when we try to provide services to businesses, I mean, they ask us a million questions and make us do all these different certifications and things like that. So I think it's going to continually put pressure on SaaS vendors that they have to have certain capabilities to even try to get business.
I only ask that because we've been speaking the whole time about the future of SaaS. Everything's going to end in SaaS. Everything's cloud. So to me, the people who don't have this functionality is really concerning. I mean, yes, from a security perspective alone, but then even from a trust perspective as well. Like there are a lot of SaaS-based companies out there that don't have this, and I'm just really curious. And I don't know. I just, when you were talking, I was just like, yeah, why isn't there like some global standard that there's some regulation around it? Because that would potentially solve just a lot of problems in terms of like brute force attacks and all that type of stuff. Like it definitely mitigates a lot of those attacks just very purely and simple just because of that alone, that control. So I was just really curious to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I've talked to, and I won't linger on this too much, but I've talked to some banks around and heard people from banks give talks, and it's like kind of why isn't it required for banking? And it's because they're so concerned with blocking their legitimate customer base, and some of them might be very sort of tech illiterate, or at least not great with tech, and so it's hard for them, or they don't have the right phone or whatever. And so I do understand some of that, and a lot of these SaaS apps or whatever they are, the whole point of them is to give access to their customers to some sort of business or consumer benefit. But to your points, it needs to be required. And quite frankly, if you haven't turned on 2FA, you're compromised. I'm telling you here, I'm telling everyone here, if you haven't turned on 2FA, you're compromised.
Well, I've absolutely loved your thoughts and your opinions and your knowledge. I also like your forward thinking and just your approach to the industry, like SaaS alone, but just in general. So, Ben, I've really appreciated the time. If people are keen to perhaps ask you a question that I didn't ask you, how can they go about doing that?
Sure. So B Johnson at obsidiansecurity.com, or find me on LinkedIn, Ben Johnson, or at Chicago Ben on Twitter. So really anywhere you want to find me, I'm there.
Awesome. Well, again, Ben, I really appreciate your time, and I really loved a lot of the insight that you've shared with myself, but also our broader audience. Thanks again.
Thanks, Carissa.
Thanks for tuning in. As always, we hope you got some new ideas or ways of thinking from this episode. And remember, you can always reach out to our guests if you do have more questions. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, and we always love to hear your feedback. So leave a review on iTunes, and we might just give you a shout out on a future episode. You can find me on LinkedIn as well as on @IamCarissaBreen on Twitter and Instagram. And if you'd like to know more about how we help tech companies, check out CarissaBreenIndustries.com. Until next time, stay safer.